Okay, great. So good evening, everybody. I'm Sarit Zahavi, Alma's CEO. Thank you for joining us here today. And our panel today will deal with the challenges of 2022. Maybe not only challenges, maybe also opportunities of 2022 in the Middle East. And for those of you who are not familiar with what we do here in Alma, you can see Alma Center behind me. It is an independent, non-partisan research and education center that focuses on Israel's security challenges along its northern borders. And of course, I can say it's my life mission. It's my life mission. It's my staff personal mission to provide this analysis on what is happening here, because we all live here, and we want you to know everything we know. By the way, we gather most of the information from sources in Arabic, and we provide them the information to you in English. Lebanon, Syria, South Lebanon, and of course the Iranian involvement in the region, which is the main issue, which we're also going to discuss today. We're situated, as I've said, in the northern Israel, in the Galilee, only 6 miles from the Lebanese border. You're all invited to come. It is almost the time to travel, almost the end of COVID, I hope. And that's why it's our day-to-day life when we speak about security. I invite you also to check our website, israel-alma.org. So I am proud and honored to introduce the distinguished Tony Badran, which is our guest of today for an open conversation. I met Tony after I heard some radio interviews of Tony while I was in the United States. I met Tony on Zoom, and we had an interesting discussion about what's going on in Lebanon, and I thought that we should bring this discussion to the Zoom, and this is how this idea was born. Tony is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense and Democracy, where he focuses on Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, and the geopolitics of the Levant. Born and raised in Lebanon, Tony has testified to the House of Representatives regarding US policy toward Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. His research currently focuses on the relationship between Iran's Hezbollah model and regional states, and the history of and the future scenario for Israel-Hezbollah wars. His writings have appeared in publications including the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the New York Post, the Atlantic, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and the Weekly Standard. And Tony is a columnist in Levant analysis of Tablet magazine. I'm truly honored to have you today. I'm sure it will be extremely interesting discussion, and I want to get started, drill down from Lebanon, which is close to our both hearts. And here are just 5 facts on the economic situation of Lebanon. 22,000 Lebanese liras are $1. Average salary in Lebanon is around $30 per month. Eggs box costs around $5, which is around 15% of the salary, of the average salary. 80% of the population in Lebanon is defined as poor. And in the past 3 years, have left Lebanon almost 200,000 people of a population which is around 5-6 million. Let's talk about it as well, because demography is also a question when we speak about Lebanon. The World Bank report from June 2021 says that economic and financial crisis in Lebanon is likely to rank in the top 10, maybe even possibly top 3 most severe crisis episodes globally since the mid-19th century. And I don't know, here is my question. It's an economic crisis, it's a political crisis. And here I must say that as Israelis, we have a lot of discussions of how Hezbollah, or whether Hezbollah succeeded in taking advantage of this crisis to deepen its grip, to deepen its control in the government systems and in Lebanon in general. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, well, thank you, Sarit, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And the question that you posed is 2 parts, so let's address each one. The first is about the situation in Lebanon as a descriptive. What we're seeing today in Lebanon is the end of a bubble that burst, which started really, if we want to be honest, it really started since after the Civil War ended. Sorry, since after the Civil War ended. So when the political class, which was a few years before that, also the militia warlord class, and with obviously Hezbollah being part of that and the Syrian regime being part of that, now became statesmen after the end of the war, right? And now the country that was devastated and didn't exist, now all of a sudden it was promoted as a state with institutions and banks and so on and so forth. And there was a big campaign to bring people back to Lebanon, Lebanese expatriates, to come back and invest in Lebanon. And then at some point in the 90s, they pegged the exchange rate of the lira to about 1,500 lira to the dollar. And that enabled them to live really a fiction that is not commensurate with the nature of their economy in as much as there is an economy. And the banks, and the political class in Lebanon and the financial class in Lebanon, the banking class, they're one and the same. They're very much intertwined. They began, they were living off of a steady supply of external injections of hard currency. They needed it. Once that, and they were spending well beyond their means, and the private banks exposed themselves to the risks of the sovereign, and everybody was living a fantasy, and everybody was telling everyone that they had money in the bank and all of that, and that the banks were doing, at a time when world banks couldn't, banks around the world couldn't offer interest rates more than a little over zero. Lebanon was offering 11% or 7% or 10%. So it was obviously a scam, but everyone decided to look the other way and pretend that it wasn't. And to pretend that this money in a country where you have a terrorist group that runs the place is somehow a normal place to do business, and that the banking sector and the economy is somehow untouched by the existence of this group, which of course is completely false. So all of this money was going through these banks and through the real estate sector and so on and so forth. It was money that was, a lot of it was money that was coming, there's everyone likes to talk about the story of Lebanese expatriate money that, that expatriates send back to their home country. And, it's usually about $6 to $7 billion a year, which, okay, it's that, but that's not the only money that was coming into Lebanon. So the money also came from Hezbollah's vast global illicit activities, drug deals, and drug trade, and spanning the globe from South America to Australia. So all of that was part of the money that was coming into these banks. And then things started to break in about 2011, when the Treasury Department busted the Lebanese Canadian Bank, which we started to see the amounts of money that Hezbollah was bringing in through the Lebanese banking system. And all the way to 2019, when it ended with the Jamal Trust Bank designation. But really, if you want a better look as to the integration financially between the banking system and the economy, such as it is, and Hezbollah, you look at the documents of the Al-Qard al-Hassan hack, okay? And you look and you see at the banks that are involved in this, and it's pretty much all of them, right? So it allowed for a open, classic money laundering operation to happen through the Lebanese banks, because that's where the money is coming from. Okay, and that is, like you said, there is a demographic aspect to it because of the rise of wealth and power and size of the Shia sect in Lebanon, and its relationship with Hezbollah, both in Lebanon and abroad in the diaspora. And we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, the point of this part of the answer is that this is how everything fell apart. The fantasy fell apart. And what you're seeing now is the result of that. As for, to finish very quickly on Hezbollah's position, it's a continuation of the point I was making, that the extent of Hezbollah's integration in all aspects of life in Lebanon, not just in the government, not just in parliament, not just in municipalities, not just because it has a militia, but at every level, in the banking sector, the real estate sector, the construction sector, the energy sector, everywhere, okay? So you have, and not to mention the illicit stuff as well. But so you have a very sort of diffuse presence for Hezbollah inside Lebanese life in all of its aspects. And you can see that from all of the designations that the Treasury Department has made against Hezbollah businessmen. Just look at the type of businesses, the range of businesses that they're involved in. It's basically everything, okay? So, and when you have control over ports of entry, but also illegal ports of entry, both. So a lot of people in Lebanon try to make it about illegal ports of entry, but it's not just illegal ports of entry. It's legal ports of entry too. So when you have the ability to do that, and you have a political order in which Hezbollah is the center of gravity on every level, financial, political, military, demographic. So that's how you understand, or should understand, when we talk about Hezbollah's position in Lebanon, what we're actually talking about.
And I think that what you're saying is extremely interesting, because, when I meet people from overseas trying to discuss Lebanon, many people are being misled by the criticism against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And people, compare Lebanon to, for example, Syria or other dictatorships in the region, and they see very harsh criticism from inside Lebanon, from people that are still inside Lebanon against Hezbollah. And this created like a misleading picture, as if Hezbollah is about to, to lose of its power tomorrow morning. And if most of the Lebanese are against Hezbollah, well, actually, we don't know what is the demography. We don't know exactly what is most of the Lebanese, what their religion are, and what's their view. And as you said, eventually, I'm not sure it matters, because Hezbollah is that diffused in the everyday life that it will not be easy to get rid of it, whether militarily or civically. One more point I want to mention following what you said, and I think you gave an amazing analysis about the financial deterioration of Lebanon, is the connection between the military wing and the economic wing, or the civilian wing. And I always say that there is you cannot differentiate them. You cannot separate the two. Behind both wings, it's the same mastermind. And actually, the civilian wing of Hezbollah, which is financial and social, and demography and educational and even medical in terms of COVID, this is actually the enabler to all this military capability of Hezbollah that is threatening Israel, and I think also threatening the stability of the region. And here I want to take us to another question concerning that, because we see a lot of Lebanese that are leaving Lebanon, like giving up and saying that publicly. Reporters that are saying publicly, we gave up, we are going, Lebanon is doomed. And even for myself, we always ask the question, is Lebanon doomed? So, okay, this is the future of Lebanon. It already fell in the hands of Iran. How do you see that?
Yeah, part of the answer to this is to ask, or to try to understand the nature of Lebanon as a place, as a polity, right? So a lot of people talk about Lebanon as a state, right? And they start they base their analysis from on that starting point. But that starting point assumes a lot of things about the meaning of this word, right? Whoever is using this word is coming at it from assumptions that are, generally speaking, assumptions about how states function in the West. And the fact of the matter is that historically in the Middle East, especially, I mean, I'm not, a comparative, scholar, so I'm just going to stick with the Middle East. If you look at very specifically the area of concern that we're looking, the Levant, okay? And if you look historically, and it's not that far back. I mean, the end of the Ottoman Empire, I mean, we're getting farther and farther away from it, but it's not that far, right? And so you had an empire ruling over terrain, okay? And they ruled over that terrain for 400 years. And then before that, you had different configurations of power. But the structural, unchanging fact is that the Levant territories, okay, were always non-states. They were just, or if you want to talk about them non-states, I'm still using the assumptions of Western terminology too, but the point of it is different types of states, meaning there's something called a buffer state, for instance.
Not
right?
nation states, maybe.
Yes, well, I mean, that's a later concept anyway, but like a buffer state. What is a buffer state? So you have two, let's say, imperial centers of power. Let's say one of them, traditionally, they're based in the south in Egypt. And then you have one, let's say, that's based in Anatolia in Turkey, okay? And they fight. That's the north-south axis. They fight. And then the territory in between is usually divided up as buffer states, as terrain over which they do combat. They draw a line, splitting spheres of influence. They do invasion routes through one or the other, etc. And there's an ebb and a flow. And there's a similar east-west axis, if you like. Let's say if you go to farther east to the Persian Mesopotamia complex, let's say, and west, let's say, Roman Empire or the Hellenistic Empire. So basically Europe, okay? And you have these north, south, east, west intersecting around this area, this is what it is, right? It's terrain, it's territory. So if you take this bigger or longer view, longer duration view, if you like, of the area, and then you look at Lebanon, and then you see the continuation of this in the Ottoman Empire and post-Ottoman Empire. You see the continuity a lot more clearly, and it's no longer a problematic thing to see. So this is not really, what we understand a state to be. So let's start with that recognition, and then we begin our analysis of how we look at Lebanon and people in Lebanon and people leaving Lebanon and wars. So one of the things I laugh about with one of my friends who's still actually in Lebanon is that people talk about stability in Lebanon, right? Preserving stability in Lebanon. And what's funny is if you look at the historic episodes in Lebanon since its independence, I mean, the amounts of stability or the periods of stability are systematically in between intervals, in between instability, right? I mean, it's just the nature of the place, right? So, you can have it when you have the same competition or power struggle between axes of north, south, east, west playing out. You have it when you have, various groups attaching themselves to the local communities in Lebanon, and then that becomes cause for a fight, etc. Because really what we understand as the state in Lebanon is an agreement between a very small number of sectarian oligarchs. That's what it is, right? 5, 6, 10, whatever, depends on the period, okay? That's what it is, okay? The state doesn't exist on its own as a rational entity, and then political life revolves around it. The state is whatever these guys say it is, and the institutions is whatever agreements these guys have amongst themselves. Now, historically, the balance of power between them has shifted. And since, let's say the beginning of the 21st century, okay, you have the overwhelming rise to power of the Shiites as led by Hezbollah, okay? So there's no separation in this. And in contrast with, let's say, the PLO situation where you had an external group come into a non-existing state, because that's what Lebanon is. What you have here is actually part of the founding communities in Lebanon. So when people make a distinction between Hezbollah and the state, that's a complete fallacy. I mean, at the most basic level, Hezbollah participates fully in the political life of the country, from the municipal level to the cabinet level, and the administrative level of the apparatus of the state, such as it is. Okay, so to draw that distinction is completely false, right? And that is the new development here in the latest, if you want, iteration of the competition among those little groups inside Lebanon, is that now at this point, the overwhelming power militarily, demographically, and financially, economically, etc. And of course, it helps that it is an organic part of an external power. So we go back to the model I talked about of the historical model, that you always have an imperial center that governs these spaces. In this case, you have a strange situation of a local community that is also an extension of one of the regional powers that has an expansionist project in the region. So we have an interesting development of historical processes and factors that are playing out, in addition to others that played out after the war, meaning the demographic drain, et cetera, which has contributed to this basic reality. So anyone who wants to turn the clock, leaving us and disregard all these structural elements and historical processes, is not really engaged in a proper analysis. It's engaged. That person is engaged in fantasy. And Lebanon, yes, does something very well. It promotes fantasy very well.
And I think what you're saying is exemplified clearly when we say Lebanese armed forces. And I want to focus on that for one moment, because the Lebanese armed forces are getting billions of dollars assistance by the US. Now, again, from us looking from over here, it's the US assistance is not the issue. The issue is, what is the meaning of these Lebanese armed forces after your description about the non-existence of the Lebanese state? And here again, if I'm just giving a few facts from recently, around 5,000 soldiers defected or just left the Lebanese army in this period of economic crisis. A general in the Lebanese army earns about $500 for months, but the most, low-ranked Hezbollah combatants earns the same. And of course, when we wrote a report about the Lebanese armed forces here in Alma, and we saw more and more Shiite presence in the combat unit and among the commanders, and more collaboration with Hezbollah. So when we try to analyze the situation in Lebanon, looking at also the Lebanese army, we always ask, okay, when all of these non-state non-existent state is going to completely collapse. And sometimes we find the answer or the, I don't know, the criteria in the Lebanese armed forces. As long as the Lebanese armed forces last, it is not going to completely collapse and, fall into a civil war like what we've seen in Syria. And, I would love to hear your take on that. Can the Lebanese armed forces, after everything that is now happening in Lebanon, stop a deterioration into a civil war in Lebanon?
Okay, so there's a lot of categories in this question that I think need to be rectified or clarified, because we need to be speaking on the same, foundation, if you like. So it's not because of the economic crisis that the Lebanese armed forces cannot do anything against Hezbollah. Before the Lebanese economic crisis, the armed forces couldn't do anything about Hezbollah either. It doesn't matter how much money you put into the Lebanese armed forces. They will never do anything about Hezbollah. No matter how much you train them, equip them, and build their capacity. This is a word that people in Washington love because they're playing, like a virtual board game. They don't understand what they're talking about. Capacity building, like that is the issue. It's never the issue. Never has been the issue. Never will be the issue. Even if you give the Lebanese armed forces the best, most advanced weapons and money and training, it will never, let me stress this again, it will never take action against Hezbollah, ever, okay? And it has never taken action against Hezbollah in the past, because that's not how the Lebanese arrangement, what people call the state, works. The Lebanese arrangement works is that you have all these sectarian oligarchs, which are now all junior partners to the dominant player that is Hezbollah. All of these guys are stakeholders in the system, and the army is an instrument of that system. The instrument of the system never attacks a stakeholder of the system. Never is never, because otherwise it falls apart. Because then the party that's being attacked destroys everything, pulls its people out, and it's finished. It falls apart because it's not real. It's fiction. These words, institution, army, parliament, they don't mean what they mean in the West. They're just words, okay? So if you do that in Lebanon, it ends. So instead, the military just stays there and stands there and does nothing, except for what the consensus among the oligarchs allow it to do, because it responds, it answers to them. It's a political issue and an issue of the political order. It has zero to do with capacity, money, the crisis, zero, nothing. Okay, so the issue is a political one, and that's why you see the army going after people who are either fictional creations or who are completely non-stakeholders in the system, like jihadis.
Yeah.
Okay. Things that pop up every so often, usually as a result of Hezbollah's activities or the Syrian regime's activities. And they are completely marginal and they have no position in the system whatsoever. That is allowed to be a target. But even the smallest of militias, let's say, the Ba'ath militia, or Wi'am Wahhab's Druze militia, or some minor Christian militia working with Hezbollah, or some minor Sunni militia working with Hezbollah, okay? People who are very small actors in the Lebanese system. But because they're under that umbrella of one of the major actors in the system, the LAF can never take action against them, never mind Hezbollah itself. So the LAF, as an actor in the active sense in Lebanon, is not it's a passive actor. Its job is to clean up when the oligarchy, the consensus of the system tells it to do something. And now the war on terror became a bonanza for the Lebanese regime and Hezbollah and the LAF, because genius policymakers in the United States decided that now we can funnel money to the LAF and start talking about it in ridiculous fictional terms as a partner in the war on terror. It's, again, these are, just like I said, words in Lebanon have no meaning. These are words without meaning, okay? None of these words I used right now have actual correspondence to reality. They don't exist, okay? So, but that's the way they do it. And what the political framing of it, so it started under the Bush administration, and it was a fantasy at the time because people thought that if you do this, they didn't understand the system, and they thought if you do this, you'll build up a state institution and that will counter Hezbollah and prop up the March 14 movement, blah, blah, blah. Complete nonsense. But that was the silliness of the Bush team. The Obama team that took after had an actual coherent regional strategy in mind. And it was a regional strategy built around partnership with Iran and realignment of US interests with Iran across the region. So when the Syrian war happened, it saw in the counterterrorism policy an excellent opportunity to buttress its realignment policy with Iran across the region. So it became, so first of all, Barack Obama literally referred to Iranian equities in the region that he gave American recognition to, okay? This is in a speech in 2015. And then as part of this recognition of Iranian equities or spheres of influence, etc., Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the United States, on the back of the counterterrorism policy, starts pumping in money to stabilize what are Iranian dominions, okay? But that was, under the Obama team, a deliberate strategy. The Bush team didn't know what they were doing. The Obama team knew what they were doing. The Trump team became a little bit incoherent about it because it had a lot of people in it that were from the Bush team, so they continued to believe in the fantasy of a state in Lebanon and so on and so forth. But at least the Trump team was doing an anti-Iran policy elsewhere and taking action against the Iranian elsewhere, so it mitigated that problem. But now that the Obama team is back in power, you see the continuity of the policy that is based on basically acknowledging Iranian spheres of interest, of influence, and propping them up as much as possible on the pretexts, whatever pretext, you know, humanitarian, counterterrorism, whatever you want, which is why, I mean, to veer ever so slightly into another Iranian sphere, the first thing, literally, the first thing they did when they came into office is to remove sanctions against the Houthis in Yemen. Okay, so I see that as part of a continuum. That's yes. When you see
and there is exactly an strategy. This is exactly what I want to address now, moving forward, because you spoke a lot about policy. I must say that looking on the Israeli policy, my feeling is that we didn't make, you know, the one step further to say, okay, we should look at Lebanon as you said, as falling in the hands of Hezbollah because it is integrated everywhere in the Lebanese system. And now what do we do? Now what do you do around that? And this question raised again and again and again when we speak about the maritime border negotiations, because I always ask the question, okay, if you're going to get an agreement when we speak about the maritime border, who is the agreement is going to sign with the Lebanese government? What is the Lebanese government? Who's going to get the money out of the gas drills that Lebanon will probably, you know, enjoy and find in the next few years? Eventually it will happen. So definitely
I can answer that question for you if you like.
So and you know, when we speak about the US assistance to the Lebanese army, again, as an Israeli, I'm saying, okay, fine. But what the advantage of this assistance? I think that the only advantage is about preserving the American influence in Lebanon. And what do you do around that? How do you take advantage of it?
I don't think it's a preservation of the American. That's an illusion that the proponents of this policy sell in Lebanon, in DC, with Congress primarily. It's fiction. It's a lie. It's not real. America doesn't have influence in Lebanon because of its aid. America has an influence wherever it has influence because it's a superpower, not because of its aid. It's not American aid that gives America influence over Lebanon. Okay, that's just bad faith. You know, it's a lie, pure and simple. Okay, the second thing is, I mean, because how do we know it's a lie? Because look at the fallacy that these people are promoting now. That if we don't continue to pump money into Lebanon, everything that we've built collapses. The classic sunken cost fallacy. Okay, which in and of itself shows you that the whole thing is gibberish. It's not real. It never was real. But anyway, the point is, look at the differences in. Rather, let's look at the approaches of two actors to Lebanon and the maritime issue and the gas issue, since you brought those up as an example. Let's look at France and let's look at the United States.
We actually have exactly a question here about France. Is it still has any influence in Lebanon?
Again, when we say influence, it doesn't mean what people think it means. Influence means that it can get things done because it says so. No. Okay, influence, really what it actually means is the permission to invest in Lebanon, permission by Hezbollah and Iran to invest in Lebanon. That's what that means, okay? So Emmanuel Macron comes to Beirut, meets with Hezbollah, tells them explicitly, I want to partner, to work with you to change Lebanon, whatever, okay? So, you know, and he brings with him Rodolphe Saadeh, the CEO, I think, or CFO, I don't remember what his title is, director of the major shipping company, French shipping company, CMA CGM, to rebuild the port of Beirut and start doing other, the French energy giant Total is invested in the offshore Block 9 in South Lebanon, etc. Now, there are other investments that he's interested in doing and that he will, you know, depending on whether Hezbollah allows it, he will get to do it. But the United States is doing something similar, but with the pretense, without the explicitness of the French approach. So, but it's there, and you know it's there because it comes out. It always comes out. So, for instance, when you see an interview that Amos Hochstein gave a few months ago or whatever, a few weeks ago, about what he was asked by CNBC about, what companies are going to invest in Lebanon and blah, blah, blah. And he says, there are international, European, and American companies that are willing to invest in South Lebanon. Now, maybe South Lebanon, when you say that in a different context with a different audience, they don't understand what it means. Israelis understand what that means. So the idea is very simple. The issue is not the recipient of the investment. The issue is the address of the investment. It doesn't matter if the guy holding the receipt is Hezbollah or not. Although in this case, it will be, because that's what South Lebanon is, okay? It's an issue of the address. You are pumping money and investment in a place that is dominated by this group. However whatever games you want to play and however you want to spin it, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is very simple and straightforward. You are investing in the Hezbollah order, full stop. And they acknowledge it when they, in another interview he gave, there was with an Arabic, Al-Arabiya, I think, or Al-Hadath, the interviewer caught him off guard. Like, they're so far gone down that rabbit hole, they don't understand what they sound like. So, she's asking him, about sanctions because of the gas deal involving Jordan and Egypt via Syria, etc. And he says, look, Lebanon is not under sanctions, under US sanctions. And so the interviewer tells him, but Hezbollah is under US sanctions. And you see him, if you watch it, he's taken aback and he has to take a few seconds to adjust. And then he mumbles nonsense about, I don't see Lebanon as Hezbollah. Okay. So that's when you come to the fallacy and you make a distinction that doesn't exist in reality. The fact of the matter, you're making an investment. That's what the investment is. The French, they do it openly. That's why the French haven't and will not designate Hezbollah in toto as a military and will not agree to designation.
We have tons of questions, which tons of questions here from the audience, which I highly encourage. Write more. That's great. I hope we'll be able to address all of them. But I can't move to questions without saying a few words about Syria. I think we cannot disconnect today Lebanon from Syria, what is happening in Lebanon to what is happening in Syria and vice versa. And if we talk about the civil war in Syria, it actually created a situation that Syria is divided to areas of influence. You have the areas up north, which are dominated by the Kurds, and you have the areas next to the seashore, which are partly dominated by the Russians, partly dominated by the Iranians. Southern Syria, next to our border, we know it's dominated by the Iranians, though there is also a Russian presence there. And we have American presence next to one of the border crossing, very little, by the way, American presence, and a small area that was left for the rebels. The feeling here, again, from the Israeli point of view, is that Syria became like an area that is used by major powers, Russia, Turkey, Iran, a little bit of United States, really a little bit, not enough in my point of view, that this is where they clash, this is where they compete, this is an area of rivalry between all of these. And again, my feeling is that those who are taking the lead is Russia and Iran, Turkey in very specific areas, not in areas of my concern as an Israeli, which are further to the south in Syria. So I would love if you can connect the dots between Lebanon and Syria and say a few words about that. And while on top of that, you have the whole issue of Iranian proxies and the fact that it goes line in line. Whatever the Iranians would do in Syria, it will be compatible to their policy in Lebanon and vice versa.
Right. So what you said, what you described Syria is precisely what I was telling you about the Levant, the nature of the Levant, right? That's what it is. That's how historically it's been. That's what Syria historically has been, okay? So what you're seeing in Syria in many ways is it's historical natural state, okay? As, again, territory that is carved out into various buffer states and with regional powers doing battle over it. Now, in this case, really, there is no battle that's being done. The United States was never involved in a battle in Syria. For a while, Turkey and Qatar and some of the Arab states kind of were involved in it, but for very different reasons, like especially in Turkey's case. I mean, Turkey has, like Israel, it borders that country. It has very legitimate interests in carving out a buffer area because of the multiple actors, including the PKK terrorist group that is launching a war against Turkey. So they have multiple concerns to be involved in it, right? But Barack Obama allowed Russia to come into Syria. And that he did to buttress the position of the Iranians in Syria, because that was the play. And that created obviously a very new, different from what had been there for years, geopolitical environment, which Israel has had to deal with. So far, it's been successful because it has been able to work around the Russian position to address its own security interests against the Iranians. But the Iranians have a different involvement in that society. You mentioned that their position is in South Syria, but that's not only where they are. They are in East Syria as an extension of their position in Iraq. And they are in Western Syria all along the Lebanese border as an extension of their position in Lebanon, right? So everyone carves out their little buffer area for themselves. So that's where a lot of Hezbollah's infrastructure now exists and so on and so forth. So that is going to continue as a battleground, I think, tactical battleground for Israel to just continue to go after very specific targets, so long as it has this understanding with the Russians and the Russians are allowing it. But this is playing out against a broader geopolitical background involving, again, what I mentioned about Barack Obama's policy with Iran, which is being continued, a policy of realignment with Iran, which you are seeing playing out in Vienna under the cover of the nuclear deal, whatever that is, right? Which is basically the ability of the same people in the Biden administration that worked in the Obama administration, namely Robert Malley, to basically pay the Iranians and legitimize their nuclear program. That is the background against all of this is playing out. And for Israel, obviously, this creates very new security, very different security challenges beyond sort of the tactical strikes against, a missile shipment or a drone base or whatever in Syria or even in Lebanon, with the precision guided missiles or whatever. So you have an environment that's changing, and Israel, I'm assuming the Israeli government is going to adapt to that change.
I think
one way or another.
Israel created an innovation, like we are, the startup nation. And we said, okay, we are going to deal with strategic issues with tactical means. And this is actually what we are doing with the Mabam, with the campaign between the wars. We're doing tactical attacks that has strategic meanings. But I want to go forward now for the questions. And first, I want to say to our audience that some of the questions will be answered through reports that were published by Alma Center, and my staff are just putting them here on the chat, and you can read some of the answers. Tony, I want to take one question to you that I think it's important that you will. You said penetration, you said diffusion, you said all of these words about how Hezbollah is actually integrated into all Lebanese systems. And people are asking, but these are only the Shiite systems? All social services that Hezbollah provides only to its Shiite base? So where is the other base? Where is the Sunni base? Where is the Christian base to resist against all of that?
No, it's not only providing for a Shia base. I mean, obviously, because of Lebanon's demographic and social makeup, it ends up being servicing primarily Shiite Arab, but it's not only Shiite Arab. I mean, especially as the demographic expansion happens.
Exactly. Can we talk about demography in this context? So as far as I know, it's around 50% Shiites in Lebanon, and nobody exactly knows how many.
I don't want to speculate about it, but I think that the numbers of let's say the Christians in Lebanon are a lot less than what people think they are. I think that the Shia demographic power is not just in it's not just numerical, but it's also because they are the new, like you see a lot of the new upper middle class, if you like. So that's another issue. A lot there's a relic of pre-Civil War thinking about the Shia in Lebanon as the downtrodden poor. Not anymore. Okay. You will find a lot more downtrodden and poor among the Sunnis in northern Lebanon than you will find necessarily among the Shia. But so there's a lot of wealth that was made in Africa, and there's a lot of that class that's coming to Beirut and investing and running businesses and wholesale retailers and all kinds of stuff. So, but the issue is I forgot what the initial question was about before the demographic one.
So I'm asking, Hezbollah is integrated to social systems also within Christians and Sunnis?
Yes, of course. And I mean, and look, for instance, I'll give you an easy example, right? So one of the adjacent areas, so of course, you know, the penetration happens where the borders of the communities geographically start to bleed into each other. So for instance, in the Abda district, you have the city of Al-Hadath, okay? So Al-Hadath used to be very heavily Christian, and obviously the expansion and growth of the Shia demographic into that area. Also, you can see it manifested in Hezbollah, for instance, purchasing the St. George Hospital, which becomes part of the Rasul al-Azam complex, right? That's its name is called St. George Hospital, okay? So it's now Hezbollah Hospital. It provides care, obviously, to people. There are other, you know, centers in Beirut where the mix is there's a lot more of a mix. And so, you know, there is care. People can, and I say it also beyond that, there is, on the level, forget the institutions of Hezbollah, the social institution. I'm talking on the level of retail, gasoline stations, pharmacies, steel, construction material, tile, technological commodity, you know, communication devices, you know, dishwashers, you know, all these things that are imported from abroad. Hezbollah is involved in all of it. And a lot of people are going to go and buy wholesale from them because it's cheaper, right? It's easier. So it permeates the system in a number of ways without it having to go through Hezbollah institutions, you know, social units or medical units or so on and so forth. Some of it does, but that's not necessary.
I must tell you that, and I'm moving forward to the next question. After the blast in Beirut, I asked again that it comes along the lines during our conversation, is Lebanon doomed? And I asked the same question after the blast in Beirut almost 2 years ago. And one of the things that I wrote is that I expect the Lebanese diaspora to give a hand here and to help and maybe to try to help to change things in Lebanon. Of course, this didn't happen. And there is a question here, since most Lebanese are living abroad, can they play a role in changing this very sad situation that we have described in the past hour?
That's for them to do and to decide. It's on them to do it. What's important is not to involve the United States. If Lebanese diaspora feel the need to raise money and intervene on the part of their families or compatriots in Lebanon, okay, whatever. I mean, people do whatever they want to do. The problem is involving the United States government in this effort. The United States government should have no involvement in this effort whatsoever, because there is zero interest for the United States in that effort. It's not a matter of the United States national security interest, zero.
Okay, I want to take 2 questions about the Israeli policy that I must, relate as an Israeli. And there is a question here about the 1701. How come we didn't do anything in 1701? And the fact that Hezbollah became such a monster since 2006, tripled, maybe more than tripled the amounts of artilleries. And here I must say, as a person who experienced the 2006 war when I was in the army, Israel today needs tons of legitimacy from outside and from inside as well. And I don't see an Israeli prime minister initiating an attack against Hezbollah without at least internal legitimacy for that, meaning that the Israeli people will demand that the government will go to war, because we all know today that the cost of war, there will be a cost in the Lebanese side as well. We all know that, but there will be a cost in the Israeli side, no doubt. We're speaking of evaluations of around 1,500 rockets per day with the capabilities of Hezbollah. So, even if we ignore what will happen in Lebanon, all Israelis know that we're going to have a cost to initiate this kind of operation. So I think that the Israeli government during the years, and there is no difference between Netanyahu and Bennett in this respect, both wanted to manage that, to contain that, to try to fight that in Syria, meaning try to fight all these transfer of arms from Tehran to Beirut while they are still in Syria, and that way try to stop them as much as possible. It will not prevent the risk, but maybe it will detain it. And of course, the main question during these years was the question of deterrent. Can we create a balance of deterrent in a way that though Hezbollah has a lot of capabilities and other Iranian proxies in the region, they are not carrying out daily attacks against Israel, nor against Israel in general. And which brings me, by the way, to the next question here about should Israel help send gas via Syria to Lebanon? I think that though I don't know whether Israeli gas is going through Egypt to Syria, and then I truly don't know. All I can say is that what happened with the gas and the fact that we provide gas to Egypt, collaboration with Jordan around that as well, create a different strategic atmosphere around Israel, and it builds bridges between.
No, it doesn't. Let me just stop you there. It doesn't build bridges. It doesn't create a strategic environment. None of that is real. Okay, and all of these companies that are participating in this ill-advised scheme that is being run by the Obama team, the Biden team, and especially spearheaded by the out-of-control U.S. ambassador in Beirut. This is against the law in the United States. And as a number of U.S. senators and representatives have made very clear on the Republican side, sanctions will be enforced, okay? And that's why the Egyptians are still very apprehensive about it, because they're getting very bad advice from Amos Hochstein and the Biden administration State Department, but they are not going to be able to sell this deal as not being a violation.
No, of course, I was not talking about the specific deal. I'm talking about Israeli collaboration with its neighbors around energy.
Nobody cares. Nobody cares in Lebanon if you give gas and somehow that will make people want to do peace with Israel. Okay, Hezbollah is in control.
I agree with you around that. Of course.
Yeah. So I say this because a lot of people, when they started this maritime border demarcation nonsense, they tried to sell it as some sort of an adjacent path to the Abraham Accord bandwidth.
Oh no.
And that was a deliberate misleading pitch. Okay, deliberately misleading. So there is nothing in any of this changes the geopolitical environment, other than it relieves the Hezbollah order and the Assad regime. Full stop. That's it. That's the extent of it. Now, Jordan has an interest to do that for a variety of reasons. That's their problem. The United States should not be part of this. I will not presume to speak for Israel. That's their business. But I will tell you from the point of view of US law, as I did, there's a problem. So there's that issue on the gas. But you said something earlier now, and I wanted to on UNIFIL and the fantasies that Israel.
We didn't touch on that.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing, right? This is another thing of how words and categories become devoid of all meaning in Lebanon, right? What was UNIFIL supposed to do in Lebanon versus what is UNIFIL doing in Lebanon? Okay. What was it supposed to do? And when people talk about, it's so important for maintaining peace, no, UNIFIL went from a peacekeeping force that was mandated to create a weapons-free zone in its area of operation with the LAF, which now you can tell me that was a complete cockamamie fantasy. Yes, of course it was.
Of course it was. We knew that. I knew that from day one. No doubt.
But it has now become UNIFIL, just another aid agency, like USAID.
Right.
What do they do? They provide services to the locals. They pay into Hezbollah's economy. in the South. They buy at their restaurants, in their municipalities, blah, 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 blah. Now, if people want to fund that, that's fine. I have no problem. The United States, however, should not be funding. United States taxpayer dollars should not be going to prop up Hezbollah's local economy. Okay, that's separate because UNIFIL is not what it says it is on paper. UNIFIL, in reality, is another UN aid agency. You want to put UN aid agencies in Lebanon to fund for humanitarian purposes? Sure, no problem. There are many UN aid agencies operating in Lebanon. Consolidate, send aid, humanitarian aid through them, do whatever you want, but don't sell me UNIFIL as something that it's not, okay? And the United States should not be funding that nonsense anymore as it should be funding the LAF.
Okay, again, from the Israeli point of view, it's not the official Israel. From my point of view as an Israeli, I think that what happened here is a situation that UNIFIL, there were many expectations and it couldn't deliver. There was no way that it will deliver. And I think that today, the only advantage of UNIFIL is creating kind of a very, very tactical moderation between on tactical problems that arise on the border between Israel and Lebanon.
You're talking about the liaison function. The liaison function.
Yes. By the way,
the liaison function doesn't need UNIFIL. You can run a liaison function from the office of the UN Special Representative in Lebanon, okay? And you need maybe a dozen people.
Exactly. You don't need 10,000 soldiers for that.
Exactly. You need $150 million in US taxpayer money per annum, especially when, to this day, for instance, every single Secretary General report on UNIFIL since 2018 and beginning of 2019 has mentioned that to this day, the LAF continues to obstruct UNIFIL. The LAF, okay, which we pay also for, continues to obstruct UNIFIL patrols, deny them access to the tunnels that Israel had to uncover, which were dug under UNIFIL's nose, okay? And they deny them patrol routes, when they get attacked especially by civilians, when they go on these patrol routes, and other instances of LAF Hezbollah collusion and partnership, which is the way it is across the country anyway. So if that's the case, if Israel wants a liaison function with Lebanon because it needs to talk to someone whenever there's a problem, then the proper address for that is the UN office in Beirut. Give them a staff of, I'll be generous, 25 people, and let them do that business and end US funding to UNIFIL. If France and Indonesia and Italy and Spain want to continue to fund their business, let them continue to fund their business. My advocacy and policy advice in the United States has been that the United States should terminate and not renew the UNIFIL mandate because it's a complete waste of everyone's time and of US taxpayer money.
Okay, I think we'll end up with this very bold saying that we rarely hear from policymakers, by the way, Israeli or Americans or others. And no doubt we try to answer most of your questions and we try to create a debate looking at 2022 with one of the biggest challenges in the Middle East, which is Lebanon. Always a challenge, by the way, 100 years, always a challenge to understand and always a challenge to cope with. I truly hope that we try to meet, to answer some of your questions, though I think there are tons of more question marks, as always in the Middle East. Tony, thank you so much for being with us. I was honored.
Thank you, Tony, for having me.
Guys, if you enjoyed, you would like to support ALMA, you're invited to donate. ALMA, Israel-alma.org/donate. ALMA also has tons of educational programs available online or physically. You can come back to Israel. Tony as well come back to Israel. We'll take you to the border. We'll host you here. Very, very interesting to see with your own eyes how it is to look at Hezbollah, just from the other side of the border. If you have any more questions, if you want to get in touch with us, don't hesitate. Send us an email, info@israel-alma.org. I'm Sarit Zehavi, live from the Galilee North in Israel. Tony, thank you very much. It was an amazing discussion. Bye-bye.
Bye.